in the landscapes of Lough Erne, a story almost a billion years in the making. And the preamble goes on to say that the landscapes that surround Lough Erne formed as a direct result of the underlying geology and the processes that have acted upon it. Being able to understand that geology helps us to appreciate the incredible story of the area around Lough Erne, one of a journey that began nearly 1 billion years ago and is still continuing to this day. Join us for an evening of geological storytelling.
Yes, I'm on there now.
One that will take you on an adventure through tropical seas, lush rainforests, searing hot deserts and icy wastelands, and a lot more besides, all of which is evident in the rocks and landscapes that surround Lough Erne. Now, just before I go on to talk about Kirstin, before she starts, can I ask maybe people who've come in a little bit late to make sure that their microphones are muted and that they've clicked on the stop video button. Those two buttons will be down on the left hand bottom corner of your screen. Okay. Anyway, so I'll give you a few words now about Kirstin. I'm especially looking forward to this talk tonight because I've known Kirstin both as a friend and a colleague for about, what, it must be the last 15 years, I think. So Kirstin is a member of the senior leadership team at the Geological Survey of Northern Ireland, where she's responsible for the geology and groundwater team and for the information and infrastructure team. Kirstin's individual expertise is in public engagement and communication, and she has worked extensively in geoscience education, including in her previous role as Geopark Geologist for the Marble Arch Caves.
Yes, I have a line.
Geopark. A large part of this work involves developing sustainable geological tourism products, and she has worked with organisations across the UK and Ireland in this field, and increasingly more so internationally. Kirstin works extensively with UNESCO Global Geoparks and collaborates closely with both UNESCO in Paris and with the national UNESCO commissions in both the UK and Ireland. She was a member of the first UNESCO Global Geoparks Council and is a senior evaluator on the UNESCO Global Geoparks evaluation team. She's currently the chairperson of both the UK Committee for UNESCO Global Geoparks and the Irish UNESCO Global Geoparks Committee. Most of Kirstin's work involves using geoscience as a tool for sustainable development, and she is presently studying for an MSc in climate change and development to help further this role. I'm exhausted reading all that out, so I don't know how she manages to do all that, but I know she does it extremely well. And I also know from my own personal experience that she is extremely well regarded in the international geoparks family. So I think we're all in for a treat. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Kirstin, okay?
Thank you very much, Richard. It's always it's always a bit embarrassing hearing stuff about yourself. But one thing I probably should say is probably on a more personal level, working in Fermanagh was actually my very first job after finishing university back in 2004. I finished my PhD in Durham and then took a role as Geopark Geologist, seconded from the Geological Survey. And I thought I'd only be there for 2 years and ended up staying there for nearly 8. So the Geopark, and I mean the Geopark as in both in Fermanagh and Cavan, will always be very special to me. So I'm only delighted to talk to you tonight about the landscapes around Lough Erne. So I'm just going to share my screen. I was at a meeting last week and I had severe technical difficulties, so I'm hoping this is shared. Somebody give me a thumbs up. Yes, great, thanks, Anne-Marie. So Richard has given you a bit of an introduction as to what my job is. So I put on the screen there the Department for the Economy, Geological Survey of Northern Ireland and the British Geological Survey, and just to maybe explain a little bit about how that works. So the Geological Survey of Northern Ireland is an office for the Department for the Economy, but all of its staff are actually members of staff from the British Geological Survey. So it's quite a complicated relationship. But I just happen to like the branding from the British Geological Survey, so that's why I'm using it tonight. So it just makes it look a bit better. So that's the reason why we've got this nice blue background. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to take you on a little bit of a journey. We're going to talk about the landscapes in and around Lough Erne. So what I'm going to start off by doing is look at Lough Erne from a landscape perspective, just to define the areas I'm going to talk about and the areas I'm not going to talk about. I then want to give a bit of a crash course in geology, and I apologise because I've just looked at who's on the seminar tonight, who's joined us, and there are a few geologists there, so you can just switch off for 5 minutes while I give a bit of a crash course. The reason for doing this is that it helps to understand some of the basic concepts that I'll go on to talk about later on in the main bit of the talk, which is the reading the landscapes of Lough Erne. And then I'm going to finish off by looking a little bit at the hidden landscapes of Lough Erne, and that'll become clear later on whenever I go to the last few slides. And at the end, we'll open it up to the floor, as it were, just for the questions or a bit of a discussion. I know that Richard and Anne-Marie have said about putting anything in the chat at the end, but sometimes these things pop into your heads during a talk. So if you do want to stick anything in the chat as we go along, just do that and we can address them then at the end, should you have anything that you want me to answer. So the idea tonight is just to take you on a bit of a geological journey. I love nothing more than talking about rocks and landscapes. So hopefully you can just have a bit of a relaxing evening. We'll take you on a bit of a journey back from the very deep past up to the more recent time. And then we'll finish off on how the landscapes are still changing around Lough Erne. So without further ado, I'll just kick things off. So whenever I talk about Lough Erne, I think it's very important to look at the River Erne system as a whole. I suppose being a geologist, it makes me think about the whole system and how it all interacts together. So for those of you that don't know, the Erne system itself starts in Lough Erne in County Cavan before flowing into Upper Lough Erne, which is in the lower half of that map, and then Lower Lough Erne, which is in the upper half of that map, which I always used to think was very amusing. And then it ends up in the Atlantic at Ballyshannon in County Donegal. At 100 kilometres in length, it is the second longest river system on the island, and actually is a very big catchment. It's around about 4,300 kilometres squared. So it's a really big area that we're talking about. And the reason why I'm talking about the catchment is because it's all really important with regards to the geology, because the rocks play a big part in the size of that catchment and how that catchment works. There are around about 150 islands, and I've just written it down as 150 plus because it was actually very impossible, or nearly impossible, to count all the islands that are part of the Erne system. But for tonight, I'm only going to be talking about Lough Erne, and I mean Lough Erne as in the two connected lakes of the Upper Lough and the Lower Lough, or the Broad Lough. It is the second biggest lake system in Northern Ireland, and it's probably one of our most important. It is a very strategic waterway, and it has been for centuries, if not millennia. Whether we look at the Vikings, we look at the early Christian times, look at World War II, and today, obviously, as a resource for tourism and recreation, it is a really, really important waterway. Just to give you a little bit of a flavour of some of the landscapes, because I know many of you are from Fermanagh or the area sort of in and around Fermanagh, but I see on the chat that there's lots of people from further afield. So in case you're not familiar, on the map, just in case you weren't clear, this area here is what I mean by Upper Lough Erne, which is connected to Lower Lough Erne by this small river. Hopefully you can see it. This is the back one. That's the River Erne. And then we've got the Lower Lough, or the Broad Lough, going out to the west at the Atlantic on towards Ballyshannon and County Donegal. So just some of the characteristic landscapes of the Upper Lough to start with. I have to say I'm very grateful to Richard, who sent me on a huge file of photographs. So it's a bit of a mutually beneficial talk here, because Richard sent me on lots of images. So this is the characteristic landscapes of the Upper Lough. You can see some of the small islands. A lot of these islands are actually drumlins, so if you want to keep this picture in your head for later on, that'll be very relevant. This picture is more characteristic of the Lower Lough or the Broad Lough, and you can see exactly where it gets that name from. It's almost, if you like, a very, very different landscape, and I'll go on to explain why exactly they are so different. And then, of course, the bit in between is connected by the River Erne, and that's where Enniskillen is located. And had it been different circumstances, this is where I would have been delivering this talk tonight. And whilst it is lovely to be able to go and talk to people in person, sometimes it's good to do it virtually, because number one, for sustainability, it's great, but also we get a much wider reach. So I'm really pleased we've actually got so many people here tonight, as something that probably wouldn't be possible otherwise. So I'm going to now give you a quick crash course in geology, and I do promise you it will be quick. And as I say, if you are a geologist or you have a good knowledge of geology, then please feel free to switch off at this point. And in order to give an introduction to geology, I have to go really right back to basics. And we have to first of all talk about the structure of the earth. And you're probably thinking to yourself, Kirstin, what has this got to do with Lough Erne? But I promise you, it will all become clear. It is all relevant. In order to talk about the structure of the earth, I always like to tell people to picture an apple. And if you cut that apple in half, what you would see would first of all be the core of your apple. And just like an apple, the earth has a core, and it's got the inner core and the outer core. Surrounding that core, you have the mantle when it comes to our structure. So if you want to think of this as equivalent to the flesh of your apple, if you like, the bit that you eat. Now, some people think that the mantle is molten, but it's actually not molten. It is actually solid rock, except for a very thin layer at the very, very top where there is liquid or semi-liquid rock at the top. And sitting on top of that is the crust. And just like the skin of your apple, it is very, very thin. The crust of the earth is very brittle, and it's broken up into various parts that fit together like a jigsaw. And we call each of those various parts tectonic plates. So tectonic plates are really, really important because tectonic plates are, first of all, the bits of the earth that we sit on top, and they're also the bits of the earth that move. Now, the tectonic plates that you see today are very, very different to the tectonic plates that there were on Earth millions of years ago. Because if you like, the earth is a massive recycling center. The plates move, and some plates disappear beneath other ones. And as plates move apart, they create bits of new ones, and they also rub past each other. And all of these different movements are what give us volcanoes and earthquakes. So it's very important to look at the edges of these plates. And at the edges of these plates, just like I've already described, they either pull apart, they either push together, or they slide past each other. And because of all this movement, we get new plates being created, old plates being destroyed. So the face of the earth now is very different to what it was like a very long time ago. We actually see examples of all these three different types of plate boundaries within the area around Lough Erne. And you're probably thinking to yourself, but Kirstin, we don't have any volcanoes and earthquakes. But I suppose a simple response to that is that we did do in our very, very distant past, and we do have evidence of those. And hopefully I'll show you a bit of that as we go along. The next bit of our crash course in geology is about the geological timescale. Now, whenever I was first studying geology, this was probably the hardest thing for me to get my head around. I started studying geology at GCSE at school. It was one of those filler subjects whenever you're doing your A-levels. So whenever you're, 16, 17, 18, it was to fill out my timetable. It was something I had a passing interest in. I liked going outside. I liked seeing the world around me. So I took geology, never ever thinking it would be a career. But I do remember struggling with this geological timescale. Geologists now know that the Earth is 4.5 or just over 4.5 billion years old. That, if you want to put it into numbers, is 4,500 million years old. Now, whenever you're a 16-year-old girl first studying geology, Christmas is a long time away. So to try and get your head around something like that, it was quite difficult. But I suppose it's something that we tend to now accept as read, and that the Earth is very, very old. We have worked out that the Earth itself formed at the same time as the rest of the solar system. And some of the remnants of that early solar system are found as meteorites. And whenever those meteorites crash to the ground, certain types of them, we can look at them and we can date them. And what I mean by that is we can look at the chemistry of them and we can work out what age they are. So we use isotopes, and we use a number of different types. We used lead isotopes, we use rubidium strontium isotopes, and they all consistently give us an age of around about 4.5 billion years old. And that's how we know how old the Earth is. Now, before we were able to do this sort of analytical techniques on rocks, we actually use what we call relative dating. And what that means is that we look at rocks and we assume that the ones at, say, the bottom of a pile of rocks were laid down first, and the ones at the top of a pile of rocks were laid down later. We call that the law of superposition. And really it makes sense if you think about it, because if you pour sand into a bucket of water, and then you pour another layer of sand, and then you pour another layer of sand, the layer at the top is going to be younger than the one at the bottom. It just makes sense. This theory was first thought up in the 17th century, so it's not that new a concept. But until we had the cosmochemistry that we have now, we actually weren't able to work out the accurate ages. So we used relative dating first of all. Now, the early geologists, what they did was they looked at rocks in one place, they looked at rocks in another place, they recognised that they had the same characteristics, they might have had the same fossils, and they worked out that they were in fact the same age. That is what gave us our first geological timescale, and to be honest, it's a geological timescale that we still use to this day, but we have now been able to put numbers on it. So the first geologists, whenever they were giving rocks names, they tended to give them names based on whether they were first found or some other key characteristics. And they were able to do this on a global scale. So for example, we have rocks in Fermanagh that formed in the Carboniferous period, and they are very similar to rocks in England that were formed in the Carboniferous period, but they're also very similar to ones that were formed in America and ones that were formed in places like Russia. And we've been able to work out that they are actually the same age based on their characteristics. So tonight, what I'm actually going to do is use this geological timescale that was devised based on these principles. And we're going to use the geological time periods that you're probably all very familiar with. Names like Jurassic, which of course we all know from Jurassic Park or Jurassic World. These are all names of classic geological periods. We present them as a stratigraphic column, and that just means looking at the layers of rocks, the oldest at the bottom, the youngest on the top. So for every time period I'm going to talk about tonight, I'm going to show you the column on the left-hand side of this screen. A lot of the names are ones you're familiar with. A lot of them, maybe some of them you might not be. But just to give you a little bit of an idea about what I'm talking about whenever it comes to naming these things, it actually does make a lot of sense. So the oldest rocks that we have on Earth formed during the Pre-Cambrian period, down the bottom of my pile. Now, the Pre-Cambrian period goes from the 4.5 billion years ago right up until 600 million years ago. It takes up 7/8 of the Earth's history. Now, the reason why that period is so long is because those rocks are so old and they're so mangled that it's actually very hard to break it down into smaller, easier to manage time periods. So that's why it's shown as a diagonal line or a jagged line at the bottom here. It just represents that this would go on much further below my screen. Then we move up to the Cambrian period. These are named after the Roman name or the Latin name for Wales, which is Cambria. Then we move up to the Ordination and the Silurian period. These are actually named after ancient tribes that lived in Roman Britain, the Ordovicii and the Silurii. And then we move up to the Devonian, and as you'd probably guess, this is named after Devon, because a lot of the early geologists were actually from England. And then we move up to the Carboniferous period, and it's characterized by lots of coal, and that's where the carbon comes from. We then move up to the Permian period, which is named after the city of Perm. Then we move up to the Triassic period, which has actually been given a name because it was originally broken down into 3 individual periods, hence the word tri. And then we have the Jurassic, which is named after the Jura Mountains in Switzerland. Then we have the Cretaceous period, which is the Latin word creta for chalk. So as you can imagine, any chalk that you probably know of, so for example, the Antwerp coast is from that period. Then we move up to the Paleogene and the Neogene. Now these were formerly known as the Tertiary period. It's now been broken down into 2 different periods. And then finally, we've got the Quaternary, easy for me to say. So we're actually going to go on a journey that starts out here in the Pre-Cambrian, and we're going to go right up to the Quaternary, and we're going to see what there is in between. So we also need to look at various rock types and the rock cycle. Now, there are 3 main types of rock. We break them down into sedimentary rocks, igneous rocks, and metamorphic rocks. As you've probably gathered, I am very fond of finding out where names come from. So etymology is something I like to study. So sedimentary rocks, as you can probably guess, it's not rocket science, comes from the word sediment. So sedimentary rocks are made up of sediments. So that might be something like sand, mud, or silt. They are then lithified or turned into solid rock over millions of years that give us sandstone, mudstone, siltstone. Or it might be from living organisms. It could be something like limestone, which is made up of the remnants of sea creatures, or it could be something like coal, which is essentially organic matter or the remains of plants. We then have igneous rocks, and the word igneous comes from the Latin word ignis, meaning to ignite. So these are rocks that were once molten. So they're formed when molten rock or magma cools and solidifies. And then finally, we've got metamorphic rocks. This comes from the Greek meta and morph, meaning to change form. These are rocks that are formed when heat and or pressure is added to a pre-existing rock and it changes form. So an example of that might be slate, or it could be marble. So slate, for example, is mudstone that's been pressurized and it's changed form, and marble is limestone that's been metamorphosed. It's again changed form. The important thing with a metamorphic rock is that those rocks do not melt, unlike igneous rocks. So the best analogy I can give you for a metamorphic rock is whenever you bake a cake, you put a mixture into the oven and you heat it up, and whenever it comes out, it's completely changed form. You haven't melted anything. You've put your cake mix in the oven and it's changed form. The same thing happens to your rock. Nothing's added, nothing's taken away, it just changes. On the left-hand side of my screen is the rock cycle. Now, the rock cycle is probably one of the most important concepts. And again, it just reinforces what I said earlier in that the Earth is a massive recycling plant. So if we look over at the left-hand side here at igneous rocks form, and they might form within the Earth, say, for example, whenever magma cools to form granite, or it might form as a surface in volcanoes. Whenever that is then exposed at the surface, it's subjected to weathering. Weathering means the material is loosened. Then it might be subjected to erosion and transport, and erosion is when that material is removed, and then it's transported as sediment, and it's deposited somewhere else. It could be deposited in the sea, or in a lake, or in a river, but whenever it's deposited, it then is subjected to burial and or compaction, and it turns into a solid rock or a sedimentary rock. That rock may then be buried, and it's subjected to immense heat and pressure, and it then changes to a metamorphic rock. As that metamorphic rock then gets buried further, it melts and it turns into an igneous rock, and that whole cycle repeats again and again and again. So any rock that you see on the Earth today it is as a result of these processes, and it might have started out as something completely different. For example, an igneous rock breaks down into bits of quartz and sand, and it will eventually become a sandstone, and you get the idea. It's a massive recycling plant. So you'll be pleased to know that was my crash course in geology. The reason why I wanted to do that is because we see examples of all of these plate tectonic processes. We also see examples of all these different rock types. And I also wanted to let you see the geological time scale, because that's something I'm going to refer to along the way. So before I begin, what I wanted to do first of all is show you a simplified geological map of County Fermanagh. If you're not familiar with what a geological map is, what we do is we strip off all of the soft material, the loose material, whether that be sand, soil, peat, gravel. We take everything off until the bedrock is exposed below. Obviously not physically take it off, but that's what the map represents. And then we assign each rock a different colour. So what you're looking at is a bird's eye view of the bedrock of County Fermanagh if we removed everything from on top of it. As you can see from the different colours on the map, there's actually quite a few for us to talk about. What you'll also notice in this map are these red lines. Hopefully you can see them. These red lines are faults. So a fault is a crack in the Earth's crust along which there's been movement. So quite often it will offset rocks. You can see some here, because you can imagine this line would have continued on, but it hasn't. It's now displaced. And it also then brings packages of rock into place that shouldn't really be there. So I'm going to talk about this portion of rock later on as well. So that's what a geological map of County Fermanagh looks like. I'm going to focus on the areas in and around Lower Lough Erne and Upper Lough Erne in particular, but I'll focus on some of the other bits in between just because they are relevant. You'll see on the left-hand side the main rock types that we have in the area. Now this is very, very simplified. So for example, in the Carboniferous period, we have got more than just sandstone, limestone and mudstone, but it's just to make the map easier to view. So I'm going to start right at the very beginning, and I'm going to look at the ancient foundations of the area in and around Lough Erne. Now for each of these different time periods, I'm going to show you a map of the globe, but it's not a map of the globe today. It's actually a map of the globe at the time the rocks I'm talking about were first deposited or were first formed. So we're going right back to the Pre-Cambrian period. We're looking at the oldest rocks in County Fermanagh. We're actually looking at the oldest rocks in Northern Ireland. And at that time, you'll probably notice on the map a number of things. So first of all, Northwest Ireland is located here, and Southeast Ireland is located here, because the area that now forms the island of Ireland was literally split in two, with the northern half being attached to one continent and the southern half being attached to another continent. And it wasn't until much later that those two halves joined. So that's our first point to note. The second point to note is that we are in the very, very far south of the southern hemisphere. That means we're somewhere in the region of where the present day Antarctica is. So just think about that for a second. The third thing is that there is an ice age. And what an ice age means is that there's permanent ice on one or both of the poles. And the permanent ice in this case was in the South Pole. So not only were we separated from the southern half of the island of Ireland, we were also in the very deep south of the southern hemisphere, and we were subjected to an ice age, because there's been many ice ages in the Earth's history. Now, I'm going to show you where these rocks are in and around Lough Erne, and hopefully you can see this sort of buff-coloured area. This is the area on the northern shores of Lower Lough Erne, and if any of you are familiar with the landscapes in this area, you will know they're very different from the rest of County Fermanagh. They're actually more akin to those at Donegal, and that's because the geology is the same as Donegal, and the geology very much, well, it shapes the landscape. The rocks that we find in this area in particular look a bit like this. Now, I've used the term there, banded gneiss samite, and you're probably thinking, Kirstin, what does that mean? Well, a samite is essentially the name we give to a metamorphic rock. So remember what that means. It's a rock that has been subjected to intense heat and pressure. It's a metamorphic rock that would have originally started out as a sandstone. And that sandstone has been subjected to intense heat and pressure. And that intense heat and pressure has caused the minerals in that rock to form bands of lighter, of quartz and feldspar minerals, and the darker minerals, which in this case are more than likely a biotite mica or a dark mica. It is quite a hard rock. It's a very impermeable rock, which has given rise to the poorly drained soils you get in that part of County Fermanagh. But it's also a really nice rock to look at because it is stripy. Call me shallow, but it is stripy, and it's very different to the rocks you get anywhere else. Gneissos in this case is in reference to the bands that we have in this rock. So banded gneissos is actually a bit of a silly name, but that's the name that we've given it. This rock in particular is from Tullycherry Forest, which is a Forest Service property on the northern shores of the loch. And there are some old quarries in there, and that's where I picked up this sample from. Now, in the Geological Survey of Northern Ireland's publication on the regional geology, we had this down for a date of 895 million years old, which is where the name of this talk comes from. I've said it's nearly 1 billion years in the making, and I'm afraid I've been a bit misleading, because although we've got it down in our book as 895 million years old, we actually now think it's probably a good bit younger. We think it's probably somewhere in the region of 600 and 700 million years old, but we need to do a little bit more work to work that out in detail. I suppose that just brings home the point that geology, like any other science, is one that changes. As we develop new techniques, as we develop better understandings, we are able to better interpret the rocks that we have. So watch this space so we can find out more about this rock and the actual age of it. But I am still keeping with the fact that it's the oldest in Northern Ireland, and I'm quite proud of that one. In addition to the banded gneiss-samite, there's also a rock called a pegmatite. Now this is what you can see for left-hand side. Now, pegmatite is the name we give to an igneous rock. So if you remember, that's one that was once molten, that's got very, very large crystals of feldspar. Now this, I'm ashamed to say, has not got a scale in it, and as a geologist, that is very bad practice. But just to give you a little bit of an idea, that bit of feldspar is approximately 30 centimeters from here to here, so it's actually quite a large crystal. Now, the reason why I'm telling you this is because the feldspars in those rocks on the northern shores of Lower Lough Erne were actually the basis for the foundation of Blake pottery, because that feldspar is useful in the pottery process. It also rots down into clay, a type of clay called kaolinite, and it's actually very useful in fact, it's fundamental in making the porcelain for Blake pottery. And there was actually a thriving feldspar industry in that area as well. And these are some images I've got from the Mining Heritage Trust of Ireland, which is sadly now disbanded, but there's a lot of really good information online. This is an image from the outside of an abandoned mine near Larkhill, near Blake. And this is a picture from the inside where they worked the feldspars and then a lot of it was supplied either across to England or was actually used in the pottery industry. So these rocks are very, very useful. So we're going to rattle on through geological time, and we're missing out the Ordovician and the Cambrian because we don't have any evidence of those in the area we're talking about. So we're skipping on up the Silurian period. It's around about 445 to 410 million years ago. Now you will notice that we have moved quite significantly. So the northwest of Ireland has moved a good bit further north. We're still not attached to the rest of the island. We are still attached to this continent of Laurentia, which is where North America was part of the same continent. So we were connected to North America for a long time. And you'll notice that in between the northwest of the island of Ireland and the southeast of the island of Ireland, there is an ocean, the Iapetus Ocean. Now, I mentioned that I like to know where words come from, and if any of you know your Greek mythology, Iapetus was the father of Atlantis, and Atlantis is where we get the name Atlantic from for our Atlantic Ocean. So this, if you like, was what existed before the Atlantic Ocean. Now, the Iapetus Ocean was a vast ocean. It wasn't a small one by any means. There was thousands of kilometres in between the two halves, what we know as the island of Ireland. And because of plate tectonic activity, these two bits slowly came together, which is why I've called this section Vanishing Oceans and Mountain Building. In a process called subduction, which is whenever one plate goes beneath another, the Iapetus Ocean slowly disappeared. But what we have in this area, we don't have a huge amount of evidence of the subduction itself. What we do have is evidence of this ocean, these deep water conditions. Now, if you remember, whenever I talked to you earlier on about segments of rock that exist where they shouldn't, I'm talking about this little triangle. Hopefully you can all see that. This is what we call an inlier. And an inlier is whenever there is a segment of older rock surrounded by much younger rock. In this case, this little segment is Silurian mudstone. And it's surrounded by older rock, which in this case actually is some of the Carboniferous sandstones and the limestones. This little area of Silurian rock is known as the Lisbon inlier. And I did notice in the chat that we have a couple of people in from Lisbon, so I'm actually going to ask for your help with this one. Whenever I first started to work at Marble Arch Geopark, and I was very green, I was out of university and I knew about the geology, but I didn't know a huge amount, and I started to do a little bit of research on areas I didn't know. And the Lisbon inlier cropped up, and in particular the Lisbon conglomerate. And the Lisbon conglomerate was something I was never able to find. And if you're not familiar with what conglomerate is a rock I can only describe as being a bit like a rocky road bun. So hopefully you all know what a rocky road bun is, but in case you don't, it's bits of marshmallow, raisins and biscuit that are held together by crushed up bits of digestives and chocolate. So if you like, you've got these fragments, these coarse fragments of material that are held together by finer material. That's essentially what conglomerate is, except the bigger bits are big bits of rock, and the finer bits would be something like a sandstone, something much finer. So I'm going to show you this picture. Now, the Lisbon conglomerate is actually not just conglomerate. The Lisbon conglomerate is actually made up of mudstone, sandstone, and siltstone, and they would have formed as a result of submarine avalanches, or if you like, turbidity currents. How these form is that sediments are washed off the continental shelf into deeper water conditions. They tend to sometimes be a jumbled up mixture, and that's where we think the conglomerate has come from. And because they formed so long ago, they've been subjected to a certain amount of metamorphism. So what that means is they've been subjected to a certain amount of pressure and heat. And as a result, the mudstones have turned into something that looks a little bit like slate. So a lot of this mudstone is actually described as slate. And if we look at the old quarry records, there is evidence of a couple of slate quarries that existed just outside Lisbon. Now, I did try to find that, as I mentioned, but I was never able to. So if anybody can help me out and let me know what that is, that'd be great. The pictures I'm showing you are actually from a scientific paper from a very long time ago, hence the black and white images. I think it was actually from the late 50s, early 60s. And a lot of these outcrops are likely to now be completely overgrown. Apparently, some of this slate used to be visible on the old Enniskillen railway line, but of course, being that that is no longer in use, a lot of the old exposure are now very much overgrown. So again, it just highlights the bits of geology that we do know and the bits that we don't know, and perhaps the bits that we used to know. But what's important for us is that we have evidence of an ancient ocean that's now long vanished, and it would have been quite a deep ocean, and they are the sediments that we're now seeing in and around the area of Lisbon. These rocks are very similar to the ones that make up the majority of the bedrock in County Down and in parts of County Armagh. So if any of you are familiar with some of the geology around there, this is what they're roughly equivalent to. Just to highlight what I mean whenever I talk about these rocks joining together and our plate tectonics making the two halves of the island coming together, I just wanted to show you a little bit of a schematic map, if you like, and it'll show you that whenever the two halves of the island of Ireland finally come together, we have a huge line called the Iapetus suture. Now, if you think of a suture, whenever you get stitches, whenever you've had a tear in your skin, it's, if you like, the same kind of thing. Because of plate tectonic movements, it's bringing together plate tectonics. It's bringing together these tectonic plates that join together. And generally, there's a lot of heat associated with this. There's a lot of molten rock, and this helps the sutures to form. So if you like, there's the line that goes all the way across Ireland. This goes from somewhere in the area of the present-day Shannon Estuary, and the line goes all the way up to Clogherhead, which is just in County Louth. But we feel the effects of this all the way across the island of Ireland, because these sutures aren't just one line, and you find them all the way across. If you look at this line, it goes all the way across Scotland. It can be found all the way up between Greenland and Norway. It can also be traced all the way across to North America, Newfoundland, and this is something that has a really big impact on our geology. As you would imagine, whenever we get two tectonic plates coming crashing together, that doesn't happen quietly, and we get mountain building as a result. Now, what we see now as a result of that mountain building would be the Sparrow Mountains, Donegal Highlands, the Scottish Highlands, the Appalachian Mountains in North America, all areas you're probably familiar with. They would at one point be one continuous mountain chain that would have been similar in size to the present-day Himalayas that are forming in the same way as two tectonic plates crash into each other, which is the image I have on the right-hand side. So if you look at the map in the middle here, the rocks formed in Iapetus. So we're looking at some of our rocks from that period are around about here, and they would have formed on the edge of this continent called Laurentia that I mentioned in my map earlier on. So we're going to move on a little bit in time. We're going to move to the Devonian period. Now, this is around about 400 million years ago, and you'll see that as a result of our plate tectonic movement, the two halves of the island of Ireland are now joined. Now, I should point out that the island doesn't exist, just the area that we now know as the island exists, and we were still part of this much larger continent. We are approximately 20 degrees south of the equator. And if any of you are familiar with your climate latitudes, you'll know that this is at around about the latitude of the Sahara Desert. And similarly to back then, Ireland would have been subject to intense heat. It would have been very arid, and it would have been desert conditions. Now, we know this because we can look at the rocks and we can see clues about these desert environments. So on the map, we're going to go back to it again, look at our Devonian rocks here, and they are an orangey browny colour. We see these exposed on the eastern shores of Lower Lough Erne. Particularly, this is pretty much underlying parts of Castle Artsdale Forest, and it goes all the way out into Tyrone, into the eastern side as well. So what do these really look like? Well, in Castle Artsdale, it's actually quite difficult to see because there's so much vegetation that you can't see the Devonian rocks exposed. If anybody does manage to see some exposed, please do send me in a photograph because I would love to see it. What we do have, however, if you go on out towards the Ederny and Dromore side and on out towards Tyrone, you will see some of these exposed road cuttings. And this is what the rocks look like. They are red sandstones and they're red mudstones. And generally, if you see rocks of this colour, not always, but generally, they are indicative of a desert type environment. We also have evidence of rivers, and those rivers themselves would have essentially formed as flash floods in these desert environments, and they're very, very characteristic of this time period. And they're very, very distinctive. And that's the remnants of the Devonian period that we have in the area around Lough Erne. Now, we're rattling on through geological time, and we're now moving on to the Carboniferous period, and you'll probably notice the added bit of excitement in my voice because the Carboniferous period is the time period that I did my PhD research on. So it is something I tend to get a bit carried away with. So I'll try and keep this as quick as I can. Now we're going to break this down into two separate sections. We're going to first of all talk about the lower Carboniferous, and then we're going to talk about the upper Carboniferous, because there was a significant change in between those two. So the lower Carboniferous, we're probably talking around about 340 million years ago. Ireland was a few degrees south of the equator. So if you think about the Earth now and where it's just south of the equator, you're thinking of places that are tropical. They are humid, they're warm, and they are wet. And at that time, we were actually in a continental sea. So it was a very shallow tropical sea that was rife with sea life. If you're looking at this map, all of the blue bits, all of these blue bits you can see, these are all the Carboniferous limestones, and these would have formed as a result of this shallow tropical sea. Now I'm being a bit simplistic when I just say it's all limestone, because there's a bit of a variation. We have some shales, which are a type of mudstone. We have limestones. We've got other types of rock in there as well, but predominantly we've got some nice Carboniferous limestone, and it would have formed in an environment like this. Now this is an artist's illustration of what the Carboniferous, or the lower Carboniferous period, would have looked like in County Fermanagh around about 340 million years ago. This is actually an illustration we had done when I was working at Marble Arts, just to demonstrate this, to help people understand what the landscape was like all those years ago. And each of these creatures you see in this picture, we have evidence for in the fossil record. So you'll see some of these creatures that perhaps are familiar. We've got this creature here, which is a crinoid. This is a relative of the starfish. We do still have crinoids now, but they're generally found in deep water. We have got corals, so there's lots of different types of corals. This is one type of coral called a solitary coral. We tend to find these preserved with just this hard bit here, which looks like an animal horn. We also have some of these more branching corals up the top here. We also have brachiopods and bivalves, which are essentially these seashells here. We have trilobites, which I always like to describe as being a bit like woodlice or slaters, but they would have lived in the sea. And of course, we have these creatures, which some people think are ammonites, but they're actually goniatites because they're slightly older. And we would have had fish, and we would have had abundant sharks, because the Carboniferous period was the age of the sharks. And we have evidence for all of these in the rocks in Fermanagh. So it really would have been an area that was teeming with sea life. And if you know where to look, you'll see that there are lots of fossils to be found. What the rock generally looks like when it's exposed are these lovely layers of grey limestone. It's grey because there's actually quite a lot of mud in this limestone, and that mud is essentially detritus from the sea floor, and it meant that it was very organic rich, so it was really good for a lot of sea creatures. You'll see that there are different coloured layers. Some of these are shale, or the mudstone I mentioned, but these darker layers are a rock type called chert, and chert is very similar to flint, but flint is generally restricted to much younger rocks, but it's formed in the same way. This is pretty much pure silica, and we think it is a result of sponges that lived on the bottom of this sea floor all those millions of years ago. These are just some of the fossils that you can see. This is a coral colony, so one of these branching corals. This is found up at Legacura on the eastern slopes of Quilca. And even though you might not be able to see fossils with the naked eye, if you look at it in a photomicrograph, all of these fragments are bits of fossils. So this is actually a fragment of one of those bits of branching coral. We've got bits of crinoids and all sorts of different bits and pieces in that photomicrograph. Where you see these exposed is pretty much around the shores of a lot of the lakes. This is on the shores of Lough Macneen, which ultimately feeds in to the Lough Erne system. The Hanging Rock is a lovely example of what's known as a mud mound, which is, if you like, what it says in the tin. It would have been a mound of mud, but the mud in this sense refers to a very fine-grained type of crystalline limestone. And we think it actually forms from the remains of microbes and sponges, and it doesn't have any layering in it, which is why it actually stands proud. And if you drive between Florence Court and Belcoo, you'll find that these are exposed all the way along the shores of Lough Macneen. You'll also see it exposed as escarpments. This is Knockmore. You can see the lovely limestone escarpment. Sometimes it's pale grey, And wherever it's pale grey, it means there's less mud, and it means it's more prone to cave formation. So the Knockmore limestone formation is where we get a lot of our caves forming. And you also see it along the Maho Cliffs. So this is obviously lower Lough Erne, and you can see the Maho Cliffs. This is actually all the limestone as well, and it's exposed at the very top of the cliffs there. So it is exposed at numerous places. If you see this pale grey rock, sometimes it's a bit darker, you'll know exactly what it is you're looking at. It's also found at the Loch Shore as well. These are some of the bits of limestone exposed at the Tullycastle Loch Shore Trail. Sometimes just look like grey boulders, but sometimes you'll be really lucky and you'll see this type of weathering. So if in any doubt about whether a rock is limestone, you can look for two really big clues. Number one, you can look for fossils, and generally fossils are much more common in rocks that were formed in a marine or a sea environment, such as limestone. But also if you see this kind of weathering, this is chemical weathering. And limestone is made up of calcium carbonate, which means it actually weathers in even very weakly acidic water, such as rainwater. So these little runnels are formed as rainwater falls off and runs off the limestone itself. And it's because of this feature that we get lots of caves in limestone, because it dissolves fairly readily. But this is actually quite obvious around the Loch Shore, especially at Tullycastle. So next time you're out and about, especially if the water levels are low, it's a good chance to go and see the limestone itself. I'm going to move up now to the Upper Carboniferous period, and I mentioned there was a significant change. The biggest change was that, first of all, we now only have one main continent, and this is Pangaea, and you've probably all heard of Pangaea. Pangaea is essentially just one continent, and because it's only one continent, it had a big change on the oceanic circulation. So what that means is in the flow of ocean water around the globe. And that meant, or we think what it's done, is it's had a real impact on the formation of an ice sheet. So once again, we've got an ice sheet in the southern hemisphere. So we're entering another ice age. Now, although the ice age is in the southern hemisphere, we are on the equator. So we don't really feel the effect with regards to the cold. But what we do feel the effect in is that this ice sheet really catches up a lot of the seawater, a lot of the oceanic water, and that means the sea level falls, sea level drops. Just like today, if the ice sheets melted, we will have a rise in sea level. Back then, the ice was caught up on these ice sheets, so the sea level dropped. That meant that our lovely shallow tropical sea disappeared, and we were now a terrestrial environment, so we were a land environment. We were still at the equator, so it's still warm and it's still tropical, but we were no longer covered by a shallow tropical sea. If you look at this rock, this geology map, sorry, what you'll be able to see are some of these paler rocks here. You see they're like a fawny colour. It says in the map that they're mudstone, but actually a lot of these are sandstones, and you'll see some more here. They actually make up the upland area. So this is actually Quilca Mountain down here. You'll see some of these upland areas around by Loch Navar and by Belmore and Ballintempo. These are all the upland areas, and generally these rocks that make up the upland areas are formed as a result of the Upper Carboniferous. Our environment then was dominated by rivers or fluvial environments, and we reckon that the river system that existed was somewhere along the same size as the Amazon River today, and probably a very similar environment because it is warm and humid too. That river system probably started somewhere in what we now know as Donegal. And if you remember those mountains I talked about, those Himalayan-sized mountains, because we had a humid environment, there was lots of weathering, lots of erosion, and these rivers brought with them huge amounts of sediment, because as it was weathered, it was able to be transported and brought down through the river channels and deposited. A lot of it was deposited in this area. So Quilca Mountain, the upper slopes, you'll see the change in slope there. These are all material from these massive rivers, whether it be siltstone, whether it be bits of mudstone, but predominantly at the top it's sandstone. And it's that sandstone that's actually quite weather resistant, and it means it stands proud as a plateau. So if you think of all those other areas, including, say, for example, some of the parts of Loch Navar, some of the areas about Ballintempo and Belmore, it's all the same. You'll sometimes see it exposed inland. This is the Cliffs of Braid in Loch Navar Forest. You'll see these huge big layers of sandstone. Some of these are actually channel sandstone, so they represent some of the rivers, and you'll see just how thick they are. If you look at the size of the people down here, some of these channels are actually very big. And if you're very lucky, you can actually see some features that let us know that this was a river. So we can look for things like evidence of current. We can also look at evidence of some of the plants that give us an idea of the climate. And we also have got little thin slivers of coal in here as well, that again lets us know that this was, number one, a human environment, and number two, there was lots of plant material. You'll see this very clearly up on top of Lough Erne, up on Quilca Mountain. You'll see some of these lovely layers of sandstone. And in these layers of sandstone, we've got ripple marks, and those ripples formed in the same way you would see ripples, say, for example, on a beach. But the ripples you form in a river are very different because they're asymmetrical. They indicate one direction of current, which is what you get in a river. And that's what we see up in Lough Erne. I've shared this image on the right-hand side in the middle of my screen, because I think it's actually a really nice way to demonstrate what the environment was like. So I mentioned earlier on that we were like the Amazon rainforest. We were lush vegetation. We had a humid environment. It was still quite tropical, and oxygen levels at that time were exceptionally high. So that meant that any creatures and any plants that we got actually tended to be very big. And this is something I love telling school children, because whenever you tell them that you had excuse me, you had centipedes that were around about 1 meter long, that you had dragonflies that had a wingspan of about 1.5 meters, it tends to get their attention. Some of these plants are actually horsetails, and I know a lot of you got horsetails in your garden, but some of these horsetails got to be around about 30 meters high. So if you think you've got problems with yours now, imagine what they were like back then. But it's these plants that would have actually died, and they would have fallen into the swampy environment that existed in between these river channels, and they wouldn't have decomposed properly, and over millions of years they would have turned into coal. Now, we don't have many coal exposures or coal layers in County Fermanagh, but they do have them over towards Rigna in County Roscommon and Leitrim and the Connacht coalfield, and they have exposures and coal mines up in Ballycastle as well that formed in exactly the same way. On the far right-hand side, I've actually got a bit of a fossil tree bark. And I say tree very loosely because trees haven't properly evolved yet. This is a tree fern. And we do find imprints of these in some of the sandstones, especially up in the Lough Erne area. That's how we know this environment existed. Now I'm going to rattle on through geological time, and the eagle-eyed amongst you will realise that I've skipped out the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic and the Cretaceous. It's not because I'm being lazy, it's simply because we don't have any evidence of these in the Fermanagh area. This isn't to say that they didn't exist. They might have existed once, but they're simply not there anymore. We do have exposure to these in other parts of Northern Ireland, but they just don't have any over in Fermanagh. So we are going to rattle on towards the Paleogene. Now, if you look at our map, you'll see it pretty much looks like the Earth today. It's a wee bit different, but it's getting there. You'll see that we are now much further north. We're actually probably somewhere in the region of, say, Spain, somewhere a bit Mediterranean, so maybe a bit nicer weather than we're getting at the moment, but we're still moving further north. You'll see that we do have now the Southern Atlantic Ocean, and the North Atlantic Ocean is just beginning to form, and that's why I've called this a new ocean, because that had a really profound impact on the landscapes of not just the County Fermanagh and the area around Lough Erne, but also in Northern Ireland in particular. If you have a look at our map, you'll see that the only bit that we have in the Paleogene is this horseshoe-shaped bit here, and this is known as the Garrison Sill. The reason why we don't show any more on this map is because although we do have a few other rocks, they are another feature called a dike that is actually just too small to show up on a geological map of this scale. So I'm going to show some of them to you as we go along. Before I do that, I just want to tell you a little bit about the processes that were happening at that time. So here we have Ireland and the UK. You'll see we have Greenland, and over here is North America. At that time, we were much, much closer, but we were starting to get further apart. Up until just before this time, just before around about 65 million years ago, we were all connected. But because of plate tectonic motions, we started to tear apart. And this ridge here is what is known as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, which is still operating as we speak. This is when two tectonic plates are pulling apart. We've got North America on one side, and we've got Eurasia on the other side, and that's the plate that we're part of. As a result of this tearing apart, there was stretching and thinning of the crust, and whenever that happens, you get volcanic activity, and you also get activity below ground as well. So the volcanic activity is stuff that we're very familiar with. This is what caused the Giant's Causeway. But it didn't just cause the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, it also caused the moorings to form. They're also igneous rock, but they did not come above the surface. And it also caused some of the features to form in County Fermanagh as well. I mentioned igneous dikes, and what an igneous dike is, it is, if you like, it's molten rock that has been injected or intruded into a pre-existing crack or a fault within the crust. It doesn't, however, reach the surface, so it's not usually a volcano. Whenever that rock cools and solidifies, excuse me, it crystallizes into a vertical sheet of solid rock. Now, if you're in a quarry, or if you're perhaps at a cliff at a coastal exposure, you would see this perfectly exposed as essentially a line, a vertical line of dark rock that cross-cuts the existing rock. However, whenever you're inland and there's not as much exposure, it's sometimes difficult to see, so you have to look for clues. The picture on the left-hand side is the what's known as the Cuilcagh Dike. And the Cuilcagh Dike is one of these vertical sheets of rock, but it can be traced all the way along Cuilcagh Mountain from east to west. It is a vertical sheet of igneous rock. And although we can't always see it exposed, this one in particular is exposed in one of the rivers in Cuilcagh Mountain Park. What you will see is if you look at some of the rivers on an Ordnance Survey map, you will see that the course of those rivers sometimes dramatically changes. And that is the case in Cuilcagh Mountain Park. So the three rivers that feed into Marble Arch, you've got the Owen Breen, you've got the Shrue Croppa, and you've got the Ahan Ran. If you follow them as they go on their journey from north to south, you will see that they take a dog leg, and that is where the Cuilcagh Dike is. The reason being is that these igneous rocks are more resistant to weathering and erosion, and so the river takes a different course. Just as a point of interest, one of the characteristics of this rock is now a rock called dolerite, which is very similar to basalt, which some of you will be more familiar with, except this is coarser grained. It is often characterized by spheroidal weathering or onion skin weathering. So you'll see it looks like this rock is made up of boulders, but it's not. It's just this special type of weathering that we get. You also see this in and around Lough Erne Forest, and this is called the Blackslee Dike. And if any of you are familiar with the first car park that you come to in Lough Erne Forest Drive, this is what you'll see. It's been cleared a little bit now, thankfully, but this is the Blackslee Dike, this bit here. It is a vertical sheet of rock. It is again dolerite, but it's been squeezed into or intruded into sandstone, which is on either side. And again, it's one of these features, these igneous features, that formed as a result of the opening of the North Atlantic Ocean. And then finally, this is part of the Garrison Still. This is the bit I mentioned on the map. Now, this is a picture taken many, many years ago. You'll see both Richard and I in that picture. This is one of the field trips that we led for other Geopark colleagues. But this is the Garrison Still. This layer of rock, this thick layer of rock, is igneous rock. This too is dolerite. And as opposed to the dikes that were vertical, sills are horizontal. So if you like, this molten rock has been squeezed into pre-existing layers of rock, and you can actually see the impact of this rock being squeezed into those layers because the limestone in this case has been ripped up as a result. Now, although this dolerite is now exposed at the surface, it would have been another layer of limestone on top, and it's now been taken away by weathering and erosion. This quarry was actually, this is actually near Big Dog Forest. This has been worked for, it's dolerite. It's sometimes known as whinstone, and it's a very, very hard rock. It's commonly used as road aggregate because it is so hard. And you can see that it's got quite a lot of iron in it as well, which is why it's got this rusty colour to it. But this is a lovely quarry to go and see that. And we're now on our last time period, and ironically our last time period is the one we could talk for the longest about. This is the Quaternary Period. This is our most recent time period. And because it's our most recent, it is the one we know most about. And I've rather misleadingly put up a picture of an icy wasteland, and I haven't put up a picture of a globe. The reason for that being is because the Quaternary Period is the period we're in now, so it would just be a picture of the Earth today. It is most known for being the period that we had the Ice Age in, And if any of you know me, you know that it is a bit of a bugbear for me whenever people talk about the last ice age, because we're actually currently still in an ice age. If you remember what I said earlier on, that an ice age is whenever we have permanent ice at one or both of the poles, you will know that for now anyway, we have ice at both the North Pole and the South Pole, so we're still in an ice age. What most people refer to are glaciations, because in every ice age, you get a number of glaciations. As the ice from those poles, it grows and it covers a much larger area of the Earth, and then it melts again. And this will happen a number of times. Currently, in this ice age, we've had about 6 glaciations. What does happen, however, is it's actually quite hard to find evidence of all of those, because ice is probably one of the most destructive erosive powers on Earth. When ice sheets grow, they essentially move like a very slow river of ice. And as they do, they pick up bits and pieces as they go along. If any of you have ever been to your freezer and taken out ice cubes, you'll have experienced the ice cube sticking to your finger. The same process happens when an ice sheet moves across a landscape. What's happening is that ice cube is momentarily thawing and then it's freezing again very quickly with your finger in it. That's what happens at the base and the sides of ice sheets. And as they do that, as they freeze again with the ground below in it, it plucks rocks as it goes. And as those bits of rock gather at the bottom and the sides of this ice sheet, they act as a giant sheet of sandpaper. As that sandpaper moves across the landscape, it essentially removes everything in its path, which is why we very rarely see evidence of more than one glaciation at a time. However, we have found bits and pieces, which is how we're able to work out that there are 6 glaciations. The glaciation that we know most about is obviously the most recent one. It used to be known as a Midlandian. I think it's now referred to as the Devonian, because this is a subject that is constantly changing. I'm hoping that sometime in the near future, I'll be able to get my colleague, Sam Roberson, who is the Geological Survey's Quaternary Geologist, and just to give you a bit of an idea as to how much there is to know about this subject, and that we have a geologist dedicated to this, because he'll be able to give you a much more in-depth guide on the effects of the Quaternary Period on the areas in and around Lough Erne. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a flavour. And I'm going to start off by looking at our geological map. And what I should tell you now is that that geological map shows absolutely nothing about glaciations, because all I'm looking at there is the solid bedrock. Whenever we're studying glaciations on the Quaternary Period, we essentially look at soft sediments or unconsolidated sediments. So we need a different type of geological map. We need one called a superficial geology map that shows us the bed forms. I'm going to show you now just some of the bed forms and some of the land forms that are formed as a result of the glaciation in the area in and around Lough Erne, and really ultimately it's what shaped Lough Erne, so it's a nice place for us to really end up on. The most common feature, and the one I've mentioned before, is that ice sheets or glaciers are very erosive, and one of the most characteristic features are U-shaped valleys. Lower Lough Erne, or the valley that's now occupied by Lower Lough Erne, is a classic example of that. You can see it's a lovely, broad, flat-bottomed loch, and this valley was formed as ice moved from somewhere in the direction of probably around about Omagh. They've moved west towards the Atlantic, and that's what's carved out this huge big valley. But it's also had an impact on the shape of Upper Lough Erne as well. And up until recently, it was something we didn't really understand. And we've been doing a research project with students in Royal Holloway in London who've shed a bit more light on this. And what we've actually been able to see is that one of the biggest impacts on the shape of the lochs and where they are is the underlying structural geology. So if you remember at the start, I showed you a simplified geological map and I pointed out the faults. Well, I did that for a reason, because the location of both Upper and Lower Lough Erne is a direct result of the underlying faults. So as opposed to showing you a simplified geological map, what I've done is I've looked at a general map and I've actually overlain on it all of the faults that we have based on our 250,000 scale map. All the black lines, these are all faults. It'll give you an idea as to how many we see. And each one of these, if you like, represents some kind of, if you like, plate tectonic activity. They may not be defining the edge of a plate tectonic, but if you like, these are signs of earthquakes that have happened in the distant past. What I want you to look at is this line that goes up here. This is northwest, southeast trending fault line. It's this line that has actually influenced where Upper Lough Erne is. And because of this fault, the ice has actually followed this path, and it's actually carved out where Upper Lough Erne eventually went on to occupy. And this cluster of faults here, they're a different orientation, and it's these that have caused the change in direction. And that's why we've got this funny shape, and if you like, the dog leg in Lower Lough Erne. So the location of both of the Upper and Lower Lough Erne is a direct result of the underlying faults. They, if you like, acted as a line of weakness, and therefore the ice, as it moved from somewhere in the direction of Omagh, went out towards the Atlantic, but it also actually went south as well. Oops, sorry, I've gone on too many slides. So that's one of the main landscape features that we see, and that's really, if you like, the valley structures. It's not just looking at Upper and Lower Lough Erne, but also other lochs. If you look at them, Loch McNeen in particular, that's another U-shaped valley that would have formed in the same way. But we've also got features of material that's been left behind by the ice as it moved. And one of these features is an esker. We've got quite a few eskers actually. This is one I picked out near Lisnaskea, simply because I had an image of it, but there's ones in and around Ballinamallard as well. And again, these are all as a direct result of the last glaciation. If you're not familiar with what an esker is, it's essentially a ridge, a sinuous ridge of glacial material, usually sand and gravel. And it would have formed as a sub-glacial meltwater channel. So this is our glacier. This green is the ice. Very bad choice of colour, I know that, but that is the ice. And in that we have a meltwater channel, and water is travelling through this at reasonably high pressure, and with it, it carries sand and gravel. So whenever the ice sheet melts, that material is left behind. The reason why I tell you it's at actually quite high pressure is because whenever you see these eskers in the landscape, they quite often seem to flow, if you like, uphill. And that's because they did. And it's as a direct result of the fact that they're under high pressure. So they are quite a distinctive landscape feature. You can see this one is it's very sinuous. This is only around about 2 kilometres away from Lisnaskea, but there are ones, as I say, in and around Ballinamallard as well, and very important for helping us understand the flow of these ice sheets. We also have numerous drumlins. You'll see that this hill, I'm just going to show the shape of this hill with my arrow. This is a drumlin. This is a classic shape. We've got a short steep side and a long shallow side. These actually formed again as the ice flowed. These formed beneath the glaciers. The glaciers sculpted loose material into this classic, if you like, basket of egg shape, if you look at it from above. And the majority of the islands in Upper Lough Erne formed in this way, but also some of them in Lower Lough Erne too, all as a result of the movement of the ice. And these features, if you like, are concentrated in the valley floors because that's where the ice flowed. So it's very easy for us to pick that out. We've also got more material left behind by the ice sheets as they melted in the form of glacial erratics. So these are just two, if you like, extreme examples. This is again in Quilca Mountain Park. I've actually taken one from Cavan as well. I thought it was a particularly good example. But what a glacial erratic is a large boulder that's been picked up by the ice just in the process I mentioned earlier on by plucking usually, just to give you an idea of the force of ice sheets or glaciers. And they will incorporate those big blocks into the ice. They will carry them some distance, and then they will drop them as the ice begins to melt, and it loses some of that ability to hold those materials within. They're called erratics because quite often they are very different to the material they end up being deposited on top of. The top one here is limestone, or sorry, sandstone, as it is in here, and it's deposited on top of limestone. So they're very, very different. These ones have only been transported a few kilometres, but it just gives you an idea of the strength of the ice and some of the features left behind. And then we also have moraines. This is Slieve Rushen, so again, it's just slightly across the border. And what a moraine is it's a mound or a ridge material that is being shaped by the ice. It's generally made up of sand and gravel or glacial till. And these moraines in particular are quite economically important. This one in particular was used for sand and gravel extraction, but they are just one of many moraines in the area, not just across in County Cavan, but also many of them in and around Lough Erne as well. So I'm going to leave it there with regards to my geological tour, and I'm just going to finish off very quickly with looking at the hidden landscapes of Lough Erne, and I'm only going to gloss over this because I know that coming up in one of the next series in this lecture is Martina O'Neill from the Marble Arch Caves UNESCO Global Geopark, who'll be talking about the caves and karst. But the reason why I wanted to talk about the hidden landscapes of Lough Erne is because we need to consider what's happening below ground as well as what's above ground, because that's all linked in with the geology, and in particular the flow of water, especially when you're talking about the Lough Erne catchment area. Whenever I talk about looking at our what's above ground and below ground, it's very important to have an understanding of our geology, and we've already done that. But a lot of the area is karst, and this is to do with the limestone that I mentioned earlier on. So it's any landscape that's formed by the dissolution of soluble rock, and in our case it is limestone, and it's given us some beautiful features that I've already shown you. But they're not only above ground, they're below ground as well. And this just gives you a little bit of an idea about some of those features. We've talked about some of the karst weathering features along the Tullycastle Lockshore Trail. But we've also got features such as sinkholes. We've also got dry valleys. We've also got other features such as cave entrances, sinking streams, but also below ground, there's the flow of water. And that's really important for us to understand. So if you look at areas like this, where you've got limestone pavement, they're very, very dry. If you look at areas like this, which you've got our dry valley here, again, the water doesn't flow on the surface, it's all underground. And all of that water will end up in the Lough Erne system. The Marble Arch Caves is no exception, because the water flows through the caves. It flows down the Claddagh Glen into Lough Macnean, into the Arne River, and then into the Lough Erne system. So it is all interlinked. And the same goes for this one. This is Whitefather's Cave, just across near Black Lion and Cavan. Again, flows into Lough Macnean and ends up in the Lough Erne system. So these are hidden landscapes, and it's something we all need to think about. This is another example. This is Paleogene and Killarkin in Belmore Forest, and again, the water always ends up in the Lough Erne system. This is something that we actually don't understand a huge amount of for the most part, because where this water flows is actually a very complex process. And in order to get a better understanding of how this water flows and where it ends up, it's something that that my team's looking at in the Geological Survey and doing a number of what we call dye tracing experiments. And if any of you are interested, if Science Week for Northern Ireland Science Festival ever happens, there's a really interesting event that we do to try and understand the water. I'm looking at the dye tracing experiments, and I'm going to finish off just by showing you how we do that. And just to explain a little bit about this video, and it's just really a bit of fun to finish off with, is that we put fluorescent dye into the rivers. We will then put special machines called fluorometers in the water at other parts to see where it's actually coming out. So this stream, for example, is near Belcoo, and we're able to work out where this river goes to, the cave systems it flows through, and helps us get a bit of an understanding about the flow of water and also the hidden landscapes. So looking at the geology and the water flow below it. So I'm just going to press play on this video and let you have a wee look. This is a dye called rhodamine. It's fluorescent dye, and again, it's picked up by our fluorometers that can pick up fluorescent minerals as little as 1 part per trillion. So you don't even have to be able to see them. But it's just to give you a flavour about some of the scientific experiments that we do to try and understand the hidden landscapes. And I'm going to leave it there. I probably talked